The ground shook before the sound reached me. I was under my truck, halfway through fixing a broken fuel line, when the sky over the hills turned the color of a bruise, and every bird in the county went silent at once. My name is Daniel Cole, and that was the last quiet morning I would ever have. I rolled out from under the truck just as the first shockwave hit. It was not an explosion. It was pressure, like the whole atmosphere had taken one deep breath and then pushed it back down onto the earth. Windows cracked across the street. A dog 3 houses down began to howl. I stood there in my driveway, wrench still in my hand, staring up at something that should not have existed. A shape had opened in the clouds. Not a hole, not a storm, but a tear, the way fabric splits when it is pulled from 2 directions at once. Through that tear came a ship, and then another, and then more than I could count, sliding down out of the sky like they were falling through water instead of air. They did not roar, they did not shine, they simply arrived, silent and enormous, blotting out the morning sun over my small town of Ashford Hollow. I had exactly 4 seconds to decide what kind of person I was going to be for the rest of my life. I chose to run toward my neighbor's house instead of my own, because I could hear a child crying inside it, and the parents worked the early shift at the mill. The girl was 6 years old. Her name was Ellie, and she was standing in the kitchen with her hands over her ears when I broke through the back door. I picked her up without a word, because there was no time for comfort, only for motion. Outside, the light had changed. It was a deep, cold blue now, spilling down from the ships like a searchlight the size of a small town. I ran with Ellie pressed against my chest, cutting through backyards, jumping fences I had no memory of jumping, my body doing things my mind had not agreed to. Behind us, I heard the first drop pods hit the ground. They did not sound like bombs. They sounded like something heavy being set down gently, almost polite, which made the whole thing worse somehow. Politeness has no place in an invasion. We reached the storm shelter behind the old church, just as the first walking machines came over the ridge. I only saw them for a moment, tall shapes with too many joints, moving with a smoothness that no human engineer would ever choose, because smoothness like that is built for efficiency, not for mercy. I shoved Ellie down the shelter steps and pulled the door shut above us, and in the darkness, I held her while she shook, and I did not let her see that my hands were shaking too. We stayed there for 6 hours. I know because I counted every one of them in my head, second by second, because counting was the only thing keeping me from breaking apart. Above us, the world was ending in pieces. I could feel it through the concrete, faint tremors, distant cracks, the occasional deep hum that meant something enormous was passing close by. When I finally opened the shelter door, Ashford Hollow was gone in the way I understood it. The mill was a smoking frame. The church behind us had lost its roof. Cars sat abandoned in the street with their doors open, as if their owners had simply stepped out mid-sentence and never come back. And walking through the wreckage, calm and unhurried, were more of the tall machines, scanning the ruins with slow sweeps of blue light. I had a decision to make again, and this one was harder than the first. I could hide, or I could move. Ellie was still holding my hand, and that decision made itself. We moved. We found others as we went. A retired teacher named Grace Hale who had broken her ankle escaping her house and refused to stop walking anyway. A teenager named Owen Blake who had grabbed his father's old hunting rifle and looked more terrified of it than of the machines outside. And a young father carrying 2 small children who did not speak at all, just stared straight ahead with the kind of focus that comes right before a person's mind decides to shut everything else out to survive. We were not soldiers. We were not prepared. But something strange happened as our small group moved through the ruins of Ashford Hollow, something I would not fully understand until much later. None of us suggested giving up, not once. Not even when we saw, in the distance, 3 of the walking machines herding a group of people toward an open field, the blue light pulsing over them like a searchlight counting cattle. Grace Hale was the one who said it first, in a voice that did not shake despite everything her body had been through that day. She said that whatever these things were, they clearly expected us to break. She said the way they moved, slow, unbothered, confident, was the walk of something that had never met real resistance before. I did not know if she was right, but something about hearing it out loud changed the air around us. Owen Blake stopped looking at his rifle like it was a burden and started looking at it like it was a tool. The young father blinked, as if waking up from somewhere far away, and looked down at his children with something other than blank fear. We reached the tree line at the edge of what used to be the hollow, just as the sun began to set, painting the smoke above the town in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. From there, we could see the shape of one of the great ships hanging low over the valley, and for the first time, I let myself really look at it, not as a shape of fear, but as a thing that could be studied, understood, and eventually, maybe, answered. It was enormous, larger than anything built by human hands, but it was not perfect. I could see scorch marks along one edge, faint and old, the kind of damage that gets repaired but never fully erased. Whatever these things were, they had fought before, they had been hurt before, and that meant they could be hurt again. Ellie tugged my sleeve and asked me, in the small voice of a child trying very hard to be brave, if the monsters were going to find us. I told her the truth, because I did not think lying to her would help either of us. I told her I did not know, but I also told her that we were not going to make it easy for them, and for a 6-year-old girl who had just watched her hometown disappear, that answer seemed to be enough. We spent that first night in the woods, cold, hungry, and afraid, listening to the distant sounds of a war that had arrived without asking permission. Somewhere far above the clouds, more ships were still coming through that torn seam in the sky, spreading out across the entire planet in a pattern too vast for any one person to comprehend. But down there in the dark, among strangers who had become something like family in the space of a single terrible day, I started to feel something else beneath the fear. It was small, and it was quiet, but it was there, stubborn as a heartbeat. It was the beginning of an answer to a question those ships had never thought to ask before they came. They had studied our weapons, they had studied our borders and our arguments and our long, messy history of conflict with each other. What they had not studied, what maybe could not be studied from orbit, was the thing that happens inside an ordinary person when everything familiar is taken away in a single afternoon. They had not accounted for people like Grace Hale, refusing to stop walking on a broken ankle. They had not accounted for a teenager holding his father's rifle like it suddenly meant something. They had not accounted for a mechanic from Ashford Hollow who ran toward danger instead of away from it, because somewhere inside him was a version of himself he had never needed to meet before that morning. I looked up through the bare branches at the ship, hanging silent and enormous over the valley, and for the first time since the sky had cracked open, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. It felt almost like clarity. Whatever these things were, wherever they had come from, they had made one very serious mistake. They had come to Earth expecting silence, expecting surrender, expecting a world that would fold the moment the odds turned against it. Instead, in the dark of a burned town, surrounded by strangers who refused to stop moving forward, I understood that they had woken something they did not have a name for. Not yet, but they were about to learn it, one long and difficult day at a time. The night stretched on, cold and full of distant tremors, and I held Ellie close and listened to the woods around us, waiting for the first light of a morning none of us knew we would survive to see. But somewhere in that darkness, a decision had already been made, not by any government, not by any army, but by ordinary people who had simply chosen not to stop. That decision, small as it seemed in the shadow of those massive ships, was the first real shot fired in a war the invaders did not know they had already started to lose. We did not sleep, not really. We took turns watching the tree line, passing the rifle between hands that had never held one before that day, learning its weight, the way you learn the weight of a truth you cannot put down again. Grace Hale told us stories in a low voice to keep the children calm, old stories about people who had survived worse than this, though none of us quite believed that such a thing as worse than this could exist. Owen Blake kept glancing toward the glow on the horizon where Ashford Hollow used to be, his jaw tight, his eyes older than they had been the day before. Just before dawn, we heard something new, a low mechanical whine moving fast along the tree line below us. I raised a hand for quiet, and everyone froze, even the youngest of the children understanding without words that stillness now meant survival. Through the brush, I caught a glimpse of one of the walking machines moving with more urgency than the slow, confident pace we had seen the day before. It was searching. And searching, I realized with a strange, cold clarity, was not something a conqueror does when it believes the fight is already over. Somewhere out there, someone was giving them a reason to hurry. Somewhere out there, other people like us had already decided not to make this easy. And as the first gray light of morning touched the ridge above Ashford Hollow, I understood that we were no longer just survivors hiding in the dark. We were the beginning of something the invaders had never planned for, and they were only just starting to realize it. I looked around at the faces beside me, tired, frightened, and unbroken, and I knew that whatever came next, we would not be walking backward, not one step. The war for Earth had only just begun, and already, in the ashes of one small town, its first quiet promise had already been made. 3 days later, we found the resistance camp, though it did not look like anything you would call an army. It was a collection of tents and covered trucks hidden under the canopy of an old logging road, run by people who had been teachers, farmers, nurses, and mechanics only a week before. A woman named Laura Bennett was the one who found us first, stepping out from behind a fallen log with a rifle raised but steady, her eyes sweeping over our group in a single practiced motion before she lowered the weapon and told us we were safe, at least for now. Laura had been a wildlife ranger before the invasion, and it showed in the way she moved through the forest, quiet and certain, reading the land like a book the rest of us could not see. She led us into the camp, where nearly 200 people had gathered in the days since the ships arrived, drawn together by instinct more than planning, the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape without needing a map to guide it. The camp had almost nothing in the way of real weapons. A handful of hunting rifles, some old shotguns, a few pistols people had kept locked away for reasons they probably could not have explained a week earlier. But it had something else, something I would come to understand mattered more than firepower in those early days. It had people who refused to stop thinking, even with the sky full of enemy ships and the ground still trembling with distant tremors. A retired engineer named Nathan Price had set up a workshop under a canvas tarp, and he was the one who first explained what we were truly facing. He had studied the wreckage of a smaller drone that had been brought down outside the camp 2 days before, torn apart by an improvised trap involving nothing more than a steel cable and a fallen tree. Nathan showed us the drone's remains laid out on a table, its shell cracked open like an egg. He explained that the machines relied on a kind of energy shielding, a thin barrier that could deflect concentrated blasts and fast-moving projectiles with ease. But that same shielding, he said, tapping the drone's exposed frame with a screwdriver, was tuned to react to threats it recognized, threats that matched the patterns of weapons used by the 100 or more worlds these invaders had apparently already conquered before arriving here. What the shielding did not expect, he explained, was blunt, unpredictable force. A steel cable stretched across a road at exactly the wrong height. A tree deliberately weakened and toppled at the right moment. A truck driven with total commitment into a joint the machine's own designers had assumed no living thing would ever be foolish enough or brave enough to attack directly. The shield was built to stop war. It had not been built to stop desperation. That night, sitting around a low fire hidden beneath the tree canopy so its light would not carry upward, Laura Bennett laid out a plan that made my chest tighten with both fear and something close to hope. Scouts had reported that one of the invaders' supply convoys moved along the old highway every 3 days, always at the same hour, always following the same route, because the machines, for all their advanced technology, seemed to value efficiency over unpredictability. Efficiency, Laura said, was a kind of weakness if you knew how to use it against them. The plan was simple in shape, but dangerous in every detail. We would target a narrow section of the highway, where the road cut between 2 steep embankments, a place with no room to maneuver and no easy escape for the convoy, if something went wrong at exactly the right moment. Nathan had already designed a series of improvised charges using salvaged fuel and old mining equipment abandoned nearby, powerful enough to bring down the embankments themselves and bury the convoy under tons of rock and earth before its defenses could even register the threat as something worth responding to. I volunteered before I had fully decided to, my hand rising almost on its own, the way it had reached for Ellie's small hand back in Ashford Hollow. Owen Blake volunteered beside me, his jaw set, his fear now folded neatly beneath something harder and more determined. Grace Hale, still limping on her ankle, insisted on coming as well, arguing that her knowledge of the local terrain from decades of teaching field trips through these hills made her more useful than any of us wanted to admit. We spent the next 2 days preparing, and in that time, I learned more about the people around me than I had learned about most people I had known my whole life before the invasion. Laura Bennett had lost her entire ranger station on the first day, along with 3 colleagues who had been like family to her, and she carried that loss quietly, turning it into a kind of focused calm rather than letting it break her. Nathan Price had a granddaughter somewhere in the eastern part of the country he had not heard from since the ships arrived, and he worked on his devices late into the night, as if building them faster could somehow bring her news sooner. On the morning of the attack, we moved into position before dawn, taking cover in the brush along the top of the embankments, while Nathan's charges were set deep into the loose soil below. The air was cold and still, and I could hear my own heartbeat louder than I could hear the wind moving through the trees. Beside me, Owen checked his rifle for the 5th time, not because he doubted it worked, but because the motion gave his hands something to do besides shake. The convoy arrived exactly on schedule, 3 heavy transport vehicles moving in a slow, deliberate line, escorted by 2 of the tall walking machines whose blue running lights swept the road ahead in steady, unhurried arcs. Watching them approach, I understood exactly what Laura had meant about efficiency being a weakness. They moved with the confidence of something that had never once needed to consider the ground beneath its own feet as a potential threat. Laura gave the signal, a single sharp whistle that cut through the morning air, and Nathan triggered the charges from his position further down the ridge. The embankments came apart in a rolling wave of earth and stone, burying the lead transport vehicle almost instantly and knocking the nearest walking machine sideways with enough force to send it crashing into the ditch below, its long limbs folding at angles they were clearly never designed to bend. For a moment, everything was chaos, dust and noise, and the groan of shifting earth, and I forced myself to remember why we were there. As the second walking machine turned toward the source of the disruption, its blue light sweeping up toward the ridge where we lay hidden, Owen fired, and I fired beside him, not because we believed our weapons could pierce its shielding, but because Nathan had told us the shielding needed a fraction of a second to recognize and respond to each new threat, and every fraction of a second we bought mattered. While the machine's shield flared and pulsed against our shots, 3 others from the camp broke cover below, dragging a length of thick steel cable across the road with practiced speed, anchoring it to 2 trees Nathan had already weakened days before. The machine, still tracking the gunfire above it, stepped forward at exactly the wrong moment, and the cable caught it hard across the lower limbs, sending it crashing down onto the broken remains of the transport vehicles below. It did not stay down for long, but it did not need to stay down for long. In the seconds it spent recovering, 2 more charges Nathan had planted directly beneath the convoy's path detonated, and this time, there was no recovery. The blast was contained, controlled, aimed carefully to avoid the sheer cliff face that could have sent debris raining down onto our own position, and when the dust finally settled, the convoy was gone, reduced to twisted, smoking wreckage scattered across the ruined stretch of highway. We did not celebrate. There was no time and no reason to, not with 2 more walking machines almost certainly already responding to the disturbance somewhere nearby. We moved fast, gathering what supplies we could from the wreckage, careful to avoid the still sparking remains of the fallen machines, and retreated back into the deep cover of the forest before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline. It was not until we were well clear of the site, moving in careful silence through the trees, that I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had just happened. We had faced two of the invaders' machines directly and walked away, not because we had overwhelming force, but because we had refused to fight the war they expected us to fight. We had used their own confidence against them, the same way Grace Hale had said back in the ruins of Ashford Hollow, the confidence of something that had never truly been challenged before. Back at camp, word of the attack spread quickly, and I watched something shift in the eyes of people who had spent the last week believing survival was the very best any of us could hope for. Laura Bennett stood in front of the gathered camp that evening, her voice carrying clearly through the trees, and she told everyone what the ambush had proven beyond any doubt. These machines could be hurt. They could be stopped. And if they could be stopped once, in one narrow stretch of highway by a group of ordinary people with almost nothing but determination and a few clever ideas, then they could be stopped again and again until the invaders finally understood exactly what kind of world they had chosen to attack. That night, for the first time since the sky over Ashford Hollow had torn open, I slept without waking every hour in fear. It was not because the danger had passed. It had not. Somewhere out there, the invaders were almost certainly recalculating their assumptions about the world beneath them, adjusting their patrols, tightening their patterns, preparing to respond to a threat they had not expected to face this soon or this seriously. But for one night, in a hidden camp beneath the trees, surrounded by people who had chosen to fight rather than fold, I allowed myself to believe, just a little, that this war was not already lost before it had truly begun. Ellie found me before I fell asleep, curling up quietly beside me the way she had every night since Ashford Hollow, and she asked me, in a voice much steadier than it had been 3 days earlier, if the bad machines were scared of us now. I thought about the wreckage on the highway, the shielding that had flared uselessly against our simple, stubborn tricks, the way the fallen machine had struggled against the cable like something that had never once imagined needing to fight for its own survival. I told her I did not know if they were scared yet, but I told her they should be, and somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, beyond the smoking wreckage of a convoy that had never made it to wherever it had been going, I believed with everything I had left that this was only the very beginning of a lesson the invaders were about to learn the hard way. The invaders did not take long to respond. Within 4 days, patrols along the old highway had tripled, and the walking machines began moving in tighter formations, no longer relying on the same predictable routes we had used against them before. Laura Bennett called it exactly what it was during one of our evening meetings under the canopy. They were learning. And if they were learning about us, she said, then it was time for us to learn just as fast about them. That was when Claire Adams arrived at the camp, 3 weeks after the invasion began, walking in from the east with a small group of survivors and a battered laptop she had somehow kept charged using a bicycle generator rigged from spare parts. Claire had worked in cybersecurity before the ships came, spending her days finding weaknesses in networks that were supposed to be unbreakable. She looked at our camp, at the fires kept low and the careful patrols circling the tree line, and she said the thing none of us had wanted to say out loud yet. Sabotage and ambush would slow the invaders down, but it would not stop them. If we wanted a real chance, we needed to understand how they communicated, how they made decisions, and most importantly, why they had chosen to fight the way they were fighting. Nathan Price had already recovered a small communication module from the wreckage of the destroyed convoy, a device about the size of a fist covered in strange, smooth material that resisted every tool he tried against it. Claire studied it for 2 full days without sleep, running wires from the bicycle generator directly into a cracked casing she had finally managed to pry open, and on the 3rd night, she called us all together with something like disbelief written across her tired face. The module was still transmitting, faint and encrypted, but transmitting nonetheless, back toward what she believed was a central relay station somewhere within 100 miles of our position. If we could reach that relay, she explained, we might be able to intercept and eventually decode enough of their communications to understand troop movements, supply schedules, and maybe even the deeper reasoning behind their strategy. Ben Carter volunteered to lead the mission almost before Claire finished speaking. He had served 2 tours overseas before returning home to Ashford County to teach high school history, and something about the calm, steady way he spoke made it easy to understand why soldiers half his age had once followed him without question. He looked around the fire at the faces gathered there, at Owen Blake, still young but no longer soft in the way he had been 3 weeks earlier, at Grace Hale, her ankle finally healed enough to move without a limp, and at me, and he said simply that this was the kind of mission that needed people willing to walk into danger with their eyes fully open. I volunteered again, the same way I had before, because staying behind while others walked into danger had started to feel like a kind of betrayal I could not live with. Owen volunteered too, though Laura made him promise, in front of everyone, that he would listen to Ben without hesitation, no matter what happened. Claire insisted on coming as well, since she was the only one among us who could read the module's signals in real time and adjust our approach if the relay station's defenses shifted unexpectedly. We left camp 2 days later, moving in a wide loop through the hills to avoid the tightened patrols, carrying only what we could not afford to lose. Nathan had built us a device, crude but effective, that could detect the faint hum of the walking machine's shielding from nearly half a mile away, giving us precious extra minutes to find cover whenever a patrol drew close. It saved us twice on the first day alone, once when a lone scout machine passed directly along the ridge above our hidden position, moving with the same slow, unhurried confidence I remembered from Ashford Hollow, still unaware that anything below it might pose a genuine threat. On the second night, we reached the outskirts of what had once been a small regional airport, now transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The invaders had reshaped the entire area, runways torn up and replaced with strange curved structures that pulsed faintly with the same blue light as the walking machines. And at the center of it all stood a tower unlike anything built by human hands, tall and narrow, humming with a low frequency I could feel in my teeth, even from our position in the tree line half a mile away. Claire confirmed what she had suspected all along. This was the relay station, and judging by the size and complexity of the structure, it was likely far more important than any simple communication relay. Ben studied the perimeter through a pair of salvaged binoculars for nearly an hour before speaking, mapping the patrol patterns of the walking machines circling the outer fence, noting the places where the patterns overlapped, and more importantly, the places where they briefly did not. It was during that long, careful watch that we saw something none of us had expected. A group of people, perhaps a dozen, moved freely within the perimeter fence, unguarded, unafraid, walking among the strange, curved structures as though they belonged there. At first I thought they might be prisoners, but their movements were too relaxed, too purposeful, and when one of them stopped to speak directly to a walking machine, gesturing calmly toward the tower, and the machine responded by adjusting its patrol path exactly as instructed, the truth settled over our small group like a cold weight none of us wanted to carry. There were humans working with the invaders, not captives, not prisoners, but collaborators, people who had decided, for reasons none of us could yet understand, that survival meant helping the very things that had torn their world apart. Ben's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady when he spoke, reminding us that understanding why would have to wait. Our mission was information, not judgment, and judgment could come later, once we understood exactly what we were truly facing. It was a hard thing to accept, watching those figures move so freely while people like Ellie huddled in hidden camps every night, but I forced myself to focus on the plan instead, because falling apart in that moment would have helped no one. We waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the collaborators had retreated into a low structure near the tower's base, and the patrol patterns settled into their most predictable rhythm. Claire led us to a narrow gap in the perimeter fence she had identified earlier, a place where the strange curved structures created a brief blind spot in the tower's sweeping scanners, and one by one, we slipped through into the heart of the invaders' territory. Inside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, charged with the same low-frequency hum that had reached us from half a mile away, but stronger now, pressing against my skin like the moments before a thunderstorm. Claire moved with quiet confidence toward a smaller structure near the base of the tower, one she believed housed the relay's primary data storage, based on the pattern of cables she had traced from the communication module back at camp. We were halfway across the open ground between the fence and the structure when Owen froze, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave a mark. Ahead of us, stepping out from behind one of the curved structures, was one of the collaborators, a man perhaps in his 40s, wearing clothes that had clearly once belonged to someone in a military uniform, though the insignia had been removed. He stopped when he saw us, and for a long, terrible moment, none of us moved, none of us breathed, waiting to see which way the next few seconds would break. He did not call out. He did not raise an alarm. Instead, he looked at us with an expression I have spent countless nights since trying to fully understand, something caught between exhaustion, shame, and a desperate, silent plea. He said only one thing before turning and walking quickly back the way he had come, his voice barely above a whisper. He said that the tower's lower levels were not guarded as heavily during the third watch, because the invaders believed no human would ever be foolish enough to come this deep into their territory. We did not know if we could trust him. Ben clearly did not, keeping his weapon raised and his eyes fixed on the man's retreating back until he disappeared from sight. But the information proved accurate, and moving quickly while the opportunity remained, we reached the smaller structure and found its entrance unguarded exactly as the man had said. Inside, the walls pulsed with soft light, tracing patterns that reminded me of circuitry, though far more organic in shape than anything I had seen before the invasion. Claire moved directly to a raised console near the center of the room, connecting a cable from her battered laptop with hands that trembled slightly, despite her outward calm, and within moments, data began scrolling across her cracked screen faster than any of us could read. She worked in near silence for almost 20 minutes, occasionally muttering something under her breath, as pieces of the invaders' language and logic slowly began to make sense to her trained eye. When she finally looked up, her expression was not one of triumph, but of something closer to disbelief. She said the invaders were not simply conquering worlds for resources or territory, as we had all assumed. Buried within the data were records, translated imperfectly, but clearly enough to understand, describing dozens of previous campaigns across worlds whose names meant nothing to any of us. In every single case, resistance had collapsed within the first 2 weeks of invasion. Populations had surrendered, not because they lacked weapons or courage, but because they lacked something the invaders' own data referred to, in a phrase Claire struggled to translate cleanly, as unified will beyond individual survival. In simpler words, every other world they had conquered had eventually reached a point where enough individuals decided their own survival mattered more than continued resistance, and once that threshold was crossed, entire populations folded almost overnight. It was not a strategy built on overwhelming force alone. It was a strategy built on patience, on waiting for fear and exhaustion to do the real work of conquest. Earth, according to a more recent entry Claire found buried deeper in the data, was behaving in a way their models had not predicted. Resistance was not weakening after the initial contact. It was, according to their own careful measurements, increasing, spreading faster than their patrols could contain it, driven by something their data continued to label, again and again, as an anomaly they did not yet fully understand. Ben read over Claire's shoulder in silence for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and steady despite everything we had just learned. He said that whatever this anomaly was that confused them so deeply, we needed to keep giving them more of it, because it was clearly the one thing their careful, patient strategy had never accounted for. We might have stayed longer, gathering more of the data scrolling endlessly across Claire's screen, but a sudden shift in the room's ambient hum made all of us go still at once. Somewhere above, the tower's rhythm had changed, the low-frequency pulse quickening in a way that felt unmistakably like alertness. Claire disconnected her cable immediately, shoving the laptop into her bag, and Ben was already moving toward the entrance, motioning for the rest of us to follow without a single wasted word. Outside, the perimeter had changed entirely from what we had observed only 20 minutes earlier. Walking machines moved with a new urgency, their blue lights sweeping faster and wider across the open ground, and somewhere near the fence, I heard raised voices, human voices, filled with fear, rather than the calm authority we had seen from the collaborators earlier. The man who had warned us was standing near the fence, surrounded by two of the walking machines, his hands raised, his voice pleading in words I could not fully make out from our distance. I understood immediately, with a cold certainty that settled deep in my chest, that his warning to us had somehow been discovered, and that his choice to help strangers moving through the shadows had cost him whatever fragile safety his collaboration had once bought him. Ben made the call instantly, without hesitation, the kind of decision that only comes from someone who has faced impossible choices before and learned to make them fast. We could not save him without revealing ourselves entirely, and revealing ourselves entirely would mean losing everything Claire had just discovered, information that could change the entire shape of this war if we managed to carry it safely back to camp. It was a brutal calculation, and I hated every part of it, but I understood, even as my chest ached with the unfairness of it, that Ben was right. We moved along the blind spot in the fence Claire had identified earlier, slipping through just as the tower's alarm pattern reached its peak, the entire complex behind us bathed in a pulsing red light that had replaced the calm blue from before. Behind us, I heard the man's voice cut off suddenly, and I forced myself not to imagine what that silence meant, focusing instead on the trees ahead, on Ellie waiting back at camp, on every reason I had left to keep moving forward instead of looking back. We ran for nearly 2 miles before Ben finally called a stop, deep enough into the forest that the pulsing red light behind us had faded into nothing more than a faint glow against the night sky. Claire checked her laptop immediately, confirming with visible relief that the data she had gathered remained intact despite the rushed extraction. Owen sat heavily against a tree, his hands finally shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and I understood exactly how he felt, because my own hands were doing the same thing. It was Grace Hale, waiting for us at the agreed rendezvous point closer to camp, who finally said the thing that had been sitting unspoken in all our chests since we fled the tower. She said that the man at the fence had made his choice when he warned us, knowing full well what it might cost him, and that choice, whatever else it meant, was not the choice of someone who truly believed in the invaders' cause. It was the choice of someone still holding on to something human, even after everything he had done to survive. I did not know if that made his loss easier to carry, but it made it easier to understand, and in the days that followed, as Claire worked tirelessly to decode more of the data we had risked so much to gather, I found myself thinking of him often, a nameless man standing at a fence, choosing in his final moments to help strangers he owed nothing to, over the invaders who had promised him safety in exchange for his loyalty. Back at camp, Claire's full analysis confirmed what Ben had said in the relay station's dim light. The invaders were patient, methodical, confident in a strategy that had never once failed them across dozens of worlds. But that same patience, that same confidence, was built entirely on an assumption they had carried with them across every conquered world before ours, an assumption that had, for the first time in their long and successful history, begun to crack. They believed, deep within the careful logic of their own data, that every population eventually broke. They had never yet faced one that simply refused, and now, standing in the ashes of Ashford Hollow, in a hidden camp beneath the trees, surrounded by ordinary people who had already proven willing to bleed rather than bow, I understood that we were not simply fighting a war for survival anymore. We were fighting to prove an assumption wrong, one that had held true across every other world the invaders had ever touched, and in doing so, we were about to teach them something no other world had ever managed to teach them before. Word of what Claire had discovered spread beyond our camp faster than any of us expected, carried along a fragile network of radio operators who had begun reaching out to one another in the weeks since the invasion began. Nathan Price, it turned out, was not the only engineer who had survived with useful knowledge intact, and within 2 weeks, our small camp of 200 had become one node in a growing web of resistance groups stretching from the coast to the mountains, all sharing what they had learned through careful, coded transmissions sent in narrow windows when the invaders' own communication patterns left brief gaps in their monitoring. Laura Bennett became the voice our camp used most often in those transmissions, her calm, steady tone carrying clearly even through the static and interference that plagued every signal. She spoke with resistance leaders in places I had never visited, a former police captain named Ryan Bell, coordinating survivors near what remained of a major coastal city, a young woman named Sophie Grant who had somehow organized nearly 1,000 people hiding in the tunnels beneath an old industrial complex further north. None of us had planned this. It had simply happened, the way our own small group had come together in the ashes of Ashford Hollow, ordinary people finding each other in the dark and refusing to face it alone. The information Claire had pulled from the relay station's data core became the foundation of something larger than any of us had imagined possible in those first desperate days. It confirmed that the invaders relied heavily on a small number of central relay towers scattered across the planet, each one coordinating patrols, supply movements, and communication for enormous stretches of territory. Destroy enough of those towers at once, Claire argued during a long night of planning that stretched from dusk until well past midnight, and the invaders' famous efficiency, the very thing that had let them conquer over 100 worlds before ours, would collapse into confusion. It was an enormous plan, far bigger than anything our camp alone could hope to carry out, but through the fragile radio network stretching across the country, and, we soon learned, across the ocean as well, other camps began reporting relay towers of their own, structures matching the description Claire had provided almost exactly. Ryan Bell's group near the coast had already mapped one less than 30 miles from their position. Sophie Grant's people beneath the industrial complex had located 2 more, though both were more heavily guarded than the one we had infiltrated. Ben Carter was the one who proposed the timing that would eventually be called, by resistance groups who never even knew each other's names, the night the sky answered back. If every relay tower we had identified could be struck within the same narrow window, he argued, the invaders would have no time to reinforce one location by weakening another, and the resulting chaos might buy us days, perhaps even weeks, of reduced coordination across their entire occupying force. Preparing for an attack of that scale took nearly a month spent gathering supplies, training more people in the careful, patient work of building improvised devices under Nathan's watchful guidance, and coordinating timing across a network held together by nothing more than shared desperation and stubborn hope. Ellie grew taller in that month, in the strange way children do even in the middle of chaos, and she had started helping Grace Hale teach basic first aid to other children in the camp, a small act of ordinary life continuing stubbornly on despite everything happening around it. I spent much of that month working alongside Nathan, learning enough about his devices to help him train a second team capable of building them without his direct supervision, because he had confided in me late one night, his voice quieter than usual, that he did not know how many more missions his aging body could survive, and he wanted to make sure the knowledge did not disappear with him if something went wrong. Something did go wrong, though not in the way any of us expected. 12 days before the planned attack, the invaders launched a sweep through our region, unlike anything we had faced since Ashford Hollow first fell. It began at dawn, without warning, 3 of the tall walking machines moving in a tight formation directly toward our camp's location, accompanied by smaller flying drones that scattered ahead of them in a wide search pattern none of our scouts had ever seen before. Laura's warning reached the camp only minutes before the machines did, and those minutes became the difference between disaster and survival for nearly 200 people who had, until that morning, believed our hidden camp was safe enough to call home. The evacuation was chaos in the truest sense, people grabbing whatever they could carry, children crying, Grace Hale moving through the crowd with a calm authority that kept the panic from tipping into something worse, directing families toward the escape routes we had planned and practiced for exactly this possibility, though none of us had truly believed we would ever need them. Ben Carter took position at the camp's main approach with 4 volunteers, myself among them, buying time for the evacuation with the same calm steadiness he had shown at the relay tower weeks before. We had learned enough by then to know exactly where to strike, and the first walking machine went down hard, under a combination of cable traps and concentrated fire aimed precisely at the joints Nathan had identified as weakest, but the other two adapted faster than we expected, spreading apart to avoid a repeat of the same trick. The flying drones found us next, small and fast, impossible to predict the way the larger walking machines had been, and it was one of these drones, diving low and sudden from an angle none of us had watched closely enough, that struck the position where Ben stood covering our retreat toward the tree line. I did not see exactly what happened, only the flash of light and the sudden absence of his voice, which had been steady and calm and directing us only seconds before. We could not stop to grieve in that moment, though grief pressed against my chest so hard I could barely breathe as I helped pull Owen back from where he had frozen, staring at the space where Ben had stood. There was still an entire camp to protect, still children and elderly people moving as fast as their bodies allowed through the trees toward the fallback position Laura had chosen weeks earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. We held the retreat long enough. That was the only comfort I could find in the days that followed, a small, hard comfort that did nothing to fill the space Ben's absence left behind. Every single person from the camp made it to the fallback position alive, scattered and frightened but alive, and I understood, even through my own grief, that this was exactly the outcome Ben would have wanted, the only outcome that would have made the cost of his final moments mean anything at all. Laura held the camp together in the days after, though I could see the weight of it settling onto her shoulders in ways that had not been there before. The particular heaviness of someone who had lost people she cared about and still had to stand in front of others and sound certain about a plan that could easily cost more lives before it was finished. She did not pretend Ben's loss did not matter. She spoke about him openly during the evening gathering 2 nights after the attack, telling stories about his steady calm, his years teaching history to teenagers who probably had no idea their teacher carried the kind of quiet strength that would one day help hold together the beginning of a resistance against an enemy from beyond the stars. Nathan Price, still shaken from the loss of a man he had come to consider something like a friend in the short weeks since the invasion began, threw himself into finishing the training he had started with me, working late into every night to make sure his knowledge would not be lost no matter what happened next. I understood, watching him work with hands that had grown steadier with practice but never quite lost their tremor of grief, that this was simply how some people carried their pain forward, transforming it into purpose because the alternative was letting it stop them entirely. The attack on the relay towers went forward exactly on schedule, 12 days after Ben's loss, because stopping was never truly an option any of us seriously considered, not after everything that had already been paid to reach this point. I carried a piece of that grief with me into the mission, along with a piece of Ben's own steady calm that I had absorbed simply from watching him lead in those final weeks. And I found, standing in position near our target tower as the countdown to the coordinated strike ticked down across a dozen resistance camps scattered across the country, that grief and determination could exist together, each one sharpening the other rather than canceling it out. At exactly the agreed hour, Nathan's devices, carried by teams he had personally trained, struck our assigned relay tower in a coordinated sequence designed to overwhelm its defenses faster than the shielding could adapt. Across the country, and across the ocean where Sophie Grant's network had somehow coordinated timing with resistance groups we would not even properly meet until months later, similar strikes hit similar towers within the same narrow window, exactly as Ben had proposed weeks before he did not live to see it carried out. The results exceeded even our most hopeful predictions. Communication between invader units across enormous stretches of territory fell into confusion for nearly 72 hours, patrols crossing paths that should have been coordinated, supply convoys arriving at locations no longer capable of receiving them, walking machines standing motionless for stretches of time our scouts could only describe as looking lost, a word none of us had ever expected to use about something built by an advanced alien civilization. It was not victory, not yet. The invaders were still here, still enormous in number, still capable of terrible destruction whenever their coordination eventually recovered. But for 72 hours across an entire planet, fighting back in small, scattered, stubborn pockets, that had somehow found a way to act as one, we had proven something Ben Carter had believed, with his whole steady heart, before he gave his life, helping us reach that proof. We had proven that the invaders' patient strategy, the one that had broken over 100 worlds before ours by simply waiting for exhaustion and fear to do their work, had finally met a population that refused to exhaust, refused to break, and refused, no matter how much it cost, to stop fighting for the world it had already lost so much defending. 2 months after the relay towers fell, the invaders changed their strategy entirely, and the change told us more about their fear than any captured data ever could. Instead of scattered patrols and patient waiting, they began concentrating their forces, pulling back from smaller settlements and gathering their remaining strength around a handful of massive command ships that had settled permanently over what used to be several of the largest cities on the continent. Claire, still working tirelessly with a growing team of former engineers and coders who had found their way to our network, believed this consolidation meant something significant. The invaders were no longer trying to conquer through patience. They were trying to hold on through force, and force, unlike patience, could be measured, predicted, and eventually answered. The largest of these command ships hung over what remained of a city on the eastern coast, a structure so enormous that resistance groups still called it simply the Giant, because no one had found a name that felt adequate for something that blotted out the sky across an entire metropolitan area. Sophie Grant's network, now grown far beyond the small group hiding beneath an industrial complex, had spent weeks studying its patterns, its patrols, and most importantly, the massive central column that fed power up from the ground into the ship's core systems, a structure Claire believed, based on data pulled from 3 more relay towers destroyed in smaller strikes over the following weeks, represented the single greatest vulnerability the invaders possessed on the entire planet. The plan to strike the Giant was the largest coordinated action any of us had ever attempted, bringing together resistance groups from across the country and, through radio contact that had slowly expanded over the preceding months, several groups from overseas as well. Laura Bennett, who had grown into a role none of us could have imagined for her back in the early days when she was simply a wildlife ranger with steady hands and a rifle, found herself coordinating logistics for a strike involving nearly 6,000 fighters across a dozen separate groups, all converging on a single target with a single, shared purpose. I stood beside her during the final planning session, held in a converted subway tunnel that Sophie's people had transformed into a command center over the preceding weeks, and I watched her trace the plan across a hand-drawn map with the same careful, deliberate movements she had once used to track wildlife through the forests near Ashford Hollow. The power column, she explained, ran through a heavily guarded access point at ground level, but Nathan's team, working from data Claire had decoded, believed a secondary maintenance shaft existed roughly half a mile from the main entrance, one the invaders had apparently never bothered reinforcing as heavily, likely because their own engineering assumed no outside force could ever reach it undetected. Owen Blake, no longer the frightened teenager clutching his father's rifle in the ruins of Ashford Hollow, had become one of Nathan's most trusted engineers over the preceding months, and it was Owen who would lead the small team responsible for reaching that maintenance shaft, while the larger force created a diversion at the main entrance, loud and dangerous enough to draw the bulk of the Giant's defenses away from the true point of attack. I volunteered to go with him, the same way I had volunteered for every mission since that first terrible morning when the sky over Ashford Hollow tore open. Grace Hale, older now in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time, insisted on coming as well, arguing that her steady presence had proven useful in every mission before this one, and none of us had the heart, or the good sense, to argue against a woman who had already proven herself right more times than any of us could count. The night of the attack arrived cold and clear, the kind of sky that made the massive shape of the Giant hanging over the ruined city almost beautiful in a terrible way, its lights casting long blue shadows across streets that had once been full of ordinary human life. 6,000 fighters moved into position across the surrounding ruins in near total silence, a silence that felt heavier than any I had experienced since the earliest days of the invasion, because everyone gathered there understood exactly how much rested on the next few hours. The diversion began exactly on schedule, a coordinated strike against the main entrance involving nearly every heavy weapon our combined resistance had managed to gather or build over the preceding months. Salvaged alien technology mixed with human ingenuity in ways that would have seemed impossible to imagine back when I was simply a mechanic fixing a broken fuel line under my truck in Ashford Hollow. The noise was tremendous, flashes of light and thunder rolling across the ruined city, drawing exactly the response Laura had predicted, walking machines and flying drones pouring toward the main entrance in overwhelming numbers. While that battle raged behind us, Owen led our small team through the ruins toward the maintenance shaft, moving fast and low through streets littered with the wreckage of buildings that had once housed ordinary human lives. The shaft, when we reached it, was exactly as Nathan's data had suggested, a narrow opening covered by a grate that Owen removed with careful, practiced movements, revealing a dark passage leading down into the earth toward the base of the power column. We moved through that passage in near-total darkness, guided only by a faint light Claire had rigged from salvaged parts, the low hum of the column growing steadily stronger around us until it felt like it was pressing directly against my chest. Grace Hale moved beside me with the same quiet determination she had shown since the very first night in the woods outside Ashford Hollow, her hand occasionally brushing my shoulder in the dark, a small, steadying reminder that none of us were facing this alone. The chamber at the base of the column opened up larger than any of us expected, a vast circular space with the massive structure rising through its center like the trunk of some enormous mechanical tree, pulsing with light that shifted from blue to something closer to white as it channeled power up toward the ship hanging silently above the ruined city. Owen moved quickly, setting the charges Nathan had spent weeks perfecting specifically for this moment, devices designed not simply to damage the column, but to overload it entirely, sending a surge of uncontrolled energy back up through the entire structure. We were nearly finished when the alarm reached us, not through sound, but through a sudden shift in the chamber's light, the steady white pulse turning sharp and red in a pattern that made my stomach drop with instant recognition. Somewhere above, the diversion at the main entrance had apparently not been enough to fully draw attention away from our position, and within seconds, the sound of rapid movement echoed down the passage behind us, walking machines forcing their way into the maintenance shaft far faster than any of us had believed possible. Grace Hale, without a single moment of hesitation, moved to block the passage entrance, drawing a weapon she had carried since the very first night we met, and calling out for the rest of us to finish the work while she bought whatever time she could. I wanted to argue, wanted to pull her back the way I had pulled Owen back after Ben's loss months before, but I understood, looking into her steady eyes in that pulsing red light, that this was a choice she had already made long before this moment arrived, and that arguing against it would only waste the very time she was offering to buy us. Owen finished setting the final charge with hands that shook but did not fail him, and Claire's device confirmed the sequence was ready, needing only distance and time before triggering. We ran back through the passage the way we had come, past the narrow section where Grace had taken position, and I caught one final glimpse of her standing firm against the darkness pressing in from the shaft above, her weapon raised, her expression calm in a way that reminded me powerfully of Ben Carter in his final steady moments outside our camp months before. We emerged from the shaft into chaos, the diversion battle still raging across the ruined streets around the giant's main entrance, and Owen triggered the charges the moment Claire's device confirmed we had cleared the minimum safe distance. The ground shook beneath us, far harder than anything I had felt since the sky first tore open over Ashford Hollow, and above us, the massive power column visible even from our distant position began to flicker, its steady white light stuttering and dimming in waves that spread visibly up toward the ship hanging in the darkness overhead. The giant's lights failed entirely. Perhaps 30 seconds later, the enormous shape hanging silent and dark against the night sky for the first time since it had arrived, and across the battlefield, I watched walking machines freeze mid-motion, their own blue lights flickering out one by one as whatever power network connected them to the ship above lost its source entirely. The battle around the main entrance did not end immediately, but its shape changed completely, resistance fighters pressing forward against defenders that had suddenly lost the coordination and confidence that had made them so formidable only minutes before. I do not remember every detail of what followed, only fragments, the sound of 6,000 voices somehow finding a way to carry across the ruined city as word spread that the giant's power had failed, the sight of smaller support ships attempting a hurried retreat from the darkened structure above, unwilling or unable to remain near a vessel that had suddenly become vulnerable in ways it had never been before. By the time the sun rose over the ruined coastline, the giant hung dark and silent above a city that had, for the first time in months, driven the invaders back rather than the other way around. We found Grace Hale's body in the passage 2 days later, once the area had been secured enough to safely search, and I will not pretend that finding her there did not break something in me that had somehow survived every other loss along the way. But I also understood, standing in that pulsing chamber that had finally gone dark and silent alongside the ship above it, that her choice, like Ben's before her, had purchased something far larger than any single life, a victory that would echo across every remaining resistance group on the planet the moment word reached them. The invaders never fully recovered from the fall of the giant. Word reached us through the radio network over the following weeks that similar consolidations elsewhere had begun failing as well, their own command structure apparently unable to maintain coordination without the massive ship that had served as its central anchor across an enormous stretch of territory. Retreat, when it finally came, arrived not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow, steady withdrawal, ships lifting away from cities and countryside alike over the course of several difficult weeks, their patient strategy finally and completely broken by a population that had simply, stubbornly, refused every single opportunity to give up. I stood with Laura Bennett, Nathan Price, Owen Blake, and Claire Adams on a hillside, overlooking what remained of Ashford Hollow nearly a year after that first terrible morning, watching the final invader ships climb up through clouds that had once torn open to release them onto our world. Ellie stood beside me too, taller now, her hand no longer needing mine to feel steady, though she reached for it anyway, the way she had that very first day, and I held it the same way I had then, because some things, even after everything the world had thrown at us, remained exactly as important as they had always been. Below us, in the ruins of a town that had once been simply an ordinary, unremarkable place before the sky cracked open above it, people had already begun the slow work of rebuilding, laying foundations for new homes among the wreckage of old ones, planting gardens in soil that had witnessed the beginning of a war none of us had chosen, but all of us had ultimately survived. Grace Hale's name was already carved into a simple wooden marker near the town center, alongside Ben Carter's and dozens of others who had given everything they had to make this moment possible. The invaders had come, expecting a world that would fold quietly under the same patient strategy that had conquered over 100 others before ours. They had studied our weapons and our history of conflict and concluded, based on everything their careful data suggested, that we would break exactly the way every other world had broken before us. What they never understood, what perhaps could not truly be understood from the cold distance of orbit, was that every ordinary person standing on that hillside beside me had already survived something before their ships ever arrived, the long, difficult, deeply human work of building a life worth protecting in the first place. They came expecting silence. Instead, they found people like Grace Hale and Ben Carter, ordinary teachers and rangers who became something far larger in the moments that mattered most. They found a mechanic from a small town who ran toward danger instead of away from it, and a little girl who learned to be brave long before she should have needed to. They found a world that had already survived its own worst nature 1,000 times over, and had simply, stubbornly, decided to survive this too. No one had warned them who we really were. By the time they finally understood, standing in the wreckage of their own broken strategy, watching their ships retreat back through the same torn seam in the sky where they had first arrived, it was already far too late for that warning to matter. We remained on that hillside until the last ship disappeared entirely from view, until the sky above Ashford Hollow returned finally and completely to nothing more than ordinary blue, and then, together, we turned and walked back down toward the town, toward the slow, patient, deeply human work of building something new out of everything we had refused to let them take.